WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are taking the Maryland Crab Cake Tour back on the road May and June into August. 31 crab cakes at 31 breweries. But in the meantime, the Maryland Lottery sponsoring our Goodwill tour here, along with our friends at Goodwill, as well as Window Nation. We'll have some Betty Boop tickets to give away on Wednesday at Conrad's Crabs up in Perry Hall, where I'm sure there'll be some World Cup games on before it's all over with. Every sports bar will be here. I've waited a long time to have this guy on. I don't talk a lot of soccer around here, although I love soccer. He's one of the toughest guys to get because he's so busy and immersed, flying all through Central America and alarms going off in the middle of the night. Grant Wahl, one time a Baltimorean by adoption and by wife and by being here. You have a more famous wife at this point in epidemiology. Grant Wahl has his own website now after many, many years at Sports Illustrated and time at CBS and Meadowlark and all sorts of places. I'll let you promote your stuff. But when I hear that Baltimore might get World Cup games, Grant, am I getting too excited? Did I get nuts on Friday texting you and saying, you got to come on and get me more excited about this, man?
It was really interesting. Thanks for having me on. It's great to talk to you, by the way. On Friday, I published on my site, grantwahl.com, a story based on calls I had made last week to get up to speed on what's happening in the bidding to host World Cup 2026, mainly in the United States. Obviously, Canada and Mexico are co-hosting some games, but it's mainly in the U.S., and in mid-June, there's going to be an official announcement on which U.S. cities, and right now they're saying 10 of them, will be hosting those games. And there's 16 cities bidding. And Baltimore and Washington, D.C. now have a joint bid, as they made it official last week. The games would be in Baltimore, though, and FanFest stuff would be in D.C.
That's all I care about. You know what I mean? You know, like, I've been in Baltimore my whole life. I haven't figured out, other than like cherry blossoms and every once and again a Springsteen show or the Stones or something, I haven't figured out that Baltimore has ever gotten the full benefit of DC ever. And you've lived here for a long time, so you feel our little stepbrother thing going on here, right?
I very much am a Baltimore guy, as you know. I lived in Baltimore for several years. My wife worked at Hopkins, loved the city, loved the soccer culture. Like getting back there, and would love to see Baltimore get World Cup games. And I certainly think it's a possibility, though I think it's going to be a challenge. And I get into that in my story. And my story isn't about what I think. It's what I'm finding out is being thought of by FIFA, by U.S. soccer, by the people who will end up deciding which U.S. cities end up hosting World Cup games.
Well, you go back far enough that a bag full of money and a guy with some parrots at the top of Trump Tower could put games in Russia before he dies, or Qatar. Speak to to all of that. Speak to the bag money. Speak to the corruption. This flat out stenchy, let's raid places in Switzerland in the middle of the night kind of corruption that I think everybody who knows anything about soccer anywhere in the world is familiar with. But I have an old 22 jersey, a U.S. 22 jersey. In 2010, I threw a soccer festival here. If you see anybody at Comcast, tell them they still owe me the 10 grand they never paid for the television. But it was when England played the U.S. I'm sure you were at that game in South Africa. And at that time, I had come back from Germany in 06, and I had been to Zurich. I had been all over Germany for games. I had seen the million people on the wall in Berlin watching games, seeing what it did there, and thinking, will we ever get a World Cup here? Well, we're America. Of course, we're going to get games at some point. They were looking at 18 and 22 back in 2010. That's why my jersey said 22 on it, because we thought 22. We're in 22. It's amazing how quickly that happens, Grant. I remember you shacking up with Peter down in Johannesburg and having all sorts of things. Feels like 5 minutes ago. But I would say this 22 jersey I had wore out. I threw it away because the letters all broke off from me wearing it. And it was like, wah, wah. We're never, World Cup games in Baltimore. How dare me dream of a soccer festival here in the Inner Harbor Basin with barges coming in with giant TV. I dreamed that dream after 06 and 10. And now I'm starting to dream again, like, DC stadium situation is so screwed up, the ownership of the football team, obviously, and where the stadium is, that somehow we've roped ourselves in on this. So bring me in on what you've learned the last couple of weeks about the Baltimore-Washington thing, that if we are one of the 10, how would this look for Baltimore?
So there's a lot in there in that question. So, like, in the last decade, we've seen FIFA be turned upside down by this US governmental investigation. And really, the date that started all of that was back in 2010. December 2nd, 2010 was when FIFA voted to award the hosting rights for the 2018 World Cup to Russia and the 22 World Cup to Qatar, beating out the United States. And that set in motion a lot of things, including this US governmental investigation, which really hit a flashpoint globally in 2015. They made a bunch of arrests of FIFA officials in Zurich who were there for a big FIFA meeting. It caused Sepp Blatter, the FIFA president, to have to resign eventually.
It was an interesting day in your life, I bet.
Oh, yeah. No, totally. I mean, just like absolute craziness. And finally, after so many years of everyone kind of knowing that FIFA was this tremendously corrupt institution and the member nations around the world, especially in certain parts of the world, tremendously corrupt, including our part of the world. We had our own people like Chuck Blazer, the American, who was implicated in all of this and indicted and ended up helping the investigation. He's now dead and lived a very colorful life, I guess is one way to put it. But like all over South America, Central American officials, and these cases are in some situations still ongoing from the US government, but it caused a big change at FIFA, and we're still seeing, I think, the effect of all of that. And do I think FIFA is currently totally clean? No way. I certainly don't. But what we have seen is that they have awarded World Cups since then to generally democracies and not authoritarian governments, right? So the United States, Canada, and Mexico ended up getting the hosting rights for the Men's World Cup in 2026. And I think everyone sort of thought that was going to happen after what happened to the U.S. bid for the 2022 World Cup that Qatar eventually got. So that's kind of where we are on that. Now, on Baltimore and its bid for World Cup hosting rights, you're right. Everyone has basically acknowledged that FedEx Field, which was the stadium that was part of the DC bid, is kind of a disaster. And the FIFA officials went on their inspection tour and they concluded that. And it was very, very much, just like FIFA saying, look, this isn't going to work. And so the Baltimore bid and the Washington, D.C. bid have now unified as one bid.
Doesn't Washington have to get, like, I have Marty Conway on all the time. Marty's been on camels over Qatar. Marty has said all along, Washington has to have games. Like, it's the capital of the free world. The thing's based, Washington has to be one of the 10. And when I saw this on Friday, and I know you're writing, maybe I am getting too excited, or am I?
I mean, the thing is that Washington does not have to be hosting games. Keep in mind, Chicago will not be hosting games. Chicago, the city, decided not even to bid because they didn't want to play FIFA's game, where FIFA demands all sorts of freebies from city governments and tax breaks and all sorts of stuff that people in Chicago and the administration, they were like, we're not going to do that. And I kind of respect that a little bit because I don't like it when public money has to go toward very profitable events for FIFA. FIFA is going to make billions of dollars off of the Men's World Cup, and then they're still demanding not to have to pay taxes in the countries where these tournaments are taking place. They're demanding that the cities provide security, that the cities provide all sorts of insurance, all sorts of backup. And so you saw cities like Chicago, like Vancouver at one point, who just said, look, we're not going to play this game. We're not going to bid. Now, interestingly, Vancouver just came back into it for Canada, and they're very likely now to host games in Canada along with Toronto and maybe Edmonton. Montreal pulled out because they didn't want to bid. They had a history of that massive debt from hosting the 76 Olympics. People have long memories. And so nobody's really guaranteed, no city, of hosting World Cup games. Now, that said, Los Angeles, New York, New Jersey are going to get games and big games in this tournament. In some cities, And that's sort of common sense, but also based on my reporting last week, they're going to get games and have much better chances. And other cities are more on the bubble. And I don't think. Here's how my reporting last week changed my mind a little bit. I thought Denver would be a lock because it's the only team or the only city bidding from the Mountain Time Zone. But I was informed that actually doesn't matter to anyone really at FIFA and in the people hosting this. And Denver's actually a city that is not expected to get games. I was told 4 cities basically don't expect them to get games. Denver's a bid city, Orlando, Cincinnati, and shoot, there was Nashville was the other one. So I was told those 4 cities, and there's 6 that are not going to get it. So those 4 likely not going to get it. And this isn't set in stone, obviously. This isn't official yet, but I feel pretty good about the people who talked to me last week and the information that they
What
have.
are they looking for? Because you are talking to Grant Wahl's here, by the way. Please go follow him. If you know anything about soccer, it goes without saying who he is. But for you, with talking to them now and saying, we're not what we picked 15 years ago, DC, just because it's DC, the pitch is awful, whatever they don't like about the DC part of this, what would they find attractive about DC ball? Like, what are they looking for? What do we need to do here?
Well, I mean, like, I do think it does matter to some extent that DC is the capital of the country. Is that going to be a deal breaker? I don't know about that. Like, I think they like the idea that the Baltimore Stadium is downtown. It's easy to get to if you're in the Baltimore area. It's not like, like Kansas City, that NFL stadium is not downtown at all. Foxborough is not downtown Boston. It's closer to Providence, Rhode Island. They're competing. And so I do think transportation wise, ease of access wise, that stadium in Baltimore is a pretty good situation. Even if it's not the fanciest NFL stadium, FIFA wants to maximize revenue as well here because this is their only money-making event, the Men's World Cup. And so they want to have stadiums that have a lot of seats. They want to have stadiums that have luxury boxes. They want to be able to maximize all of that. And it is going to be a numbers game. If FIFA names 10 U.S. cities, 6 aren't going to make it. And so you look at the other cities in the Northeast that are bidding for World Cup games. Philadelphia is bidding for World Cup games. New York, New Jersey, MetLife is bidding for World Cup games. Foxborough, Boston is also bidding for World Cup games. And not all of those cities are going to get them. And some cities have more sort of personal political influence than others. Bob Kraft, who is in charge of owns the New England Patriots, wants World Cup games in Foxborough, has been lobbying the FIFA president for quite a while to get games. And he was also Kraft, the honorary chairman of the World Cup bid committee for this whole World Cup. So
then you
Bob
take
Kraft,
Kansas City. Kansas City has had the Hunt family's been into the World Cup maybe more than they were into the AFL, right? Literally, like
right.
They are
and so
true
like
soccer people.
It is a fact that Bob Kraft and Lamar Hunt, the Hunt family, are part of the reason MLS even exists because they started the league with a couple other people back in the 90s and lost a lot of money. And I feel like there is a lot of respect toward them from the soccer community and the business community in the US. And we'll see if that helps in sort of payback here. But keep in mind, too, one thing I'm learning from a lot of these calls is a lot of this comes down to money. And so recently, the Boston mayor said Boston is not going to provide money that FIFA wants for World Cup guarantees. So that's going to be a problem for the Boston Foxborough bid. And then Philadelphia is in a great situation money-wise because for a couple of reasons. Comcast has taken a real interest in this bid, a real role in the Philadelphia bid. And I was told that Philadelphia, their bid actually said to FIFA, look, we've already got a lot of money on hand, and we're not just like these other cities, which are telling you that, oh, we'll be able to raise money. We've already got it. And so based on the calls I'm making, Philadelphia is rising faster than any other city in the U.S. in this bid process, may even get a semifinal in this tournament now. And so Philadelphia has gone from being sort of a question mark on whether they would get any games to they're being talked about as a semifinal host with New York, New Jersey, MetLife hosting the final.
It's fascinating to me. Grant Wahl is here. That Philadelphia, never going to get a Super Bowl, not Olympic, that they would get it together and say, this is our one shot. This is a one shot to have the biggest sporting event in the world come here. That I realized this 2 decades ago in regard to Baltimore and what it would mean. But the fact that we've slipped in the side door here, so if Philadelphia's in, New York's in, LA's in, Mexico, Vancouver, Toronto, the usual suspects. What does that mean for Dallas, Houston, Miami, the other bids that's maybe Santa Clara, other places that are part of the United States, so that we can do the math and get to 10, or at least get to 8 or 9 and figure out, can we be one of them?
So I did the math in my story the other day on my site. So that involves some really hard decisions. And so, like, I am kind of giving the caveat, this isn't 100% certain, but based on the reporting I've done, these are the 10 bids I think are in position to get the games. I was told that very likely that both Texas bids, Dallas and Houston, will get games. So not entirely surprising when you consider Jerry World being this futuristic stadium, and they really want it. They may get a semifinal in Dallas as well. Houston, that big NFL stadium, giant stadium, has hosted a lot of big soccer games over time. Big soccer community in Houston, very international. I was told that likely one city in Florida will get games, and that means either Miami or Orlando. I was told that Miami's presentation was very underwhelming, and yet despite that, it's still more likely that Miami gets World Cup games than Orlando, just because Miami is a much more attractive international destination for soccer fans, not necessarily Disney people, than Orlando is. And the stadium situation in Orlando is not great. That's the old Citrus Bowl Camping World Stadium, whereas Miami, they're likely to get games here. So then you look at other parts of the country. LA is going to get games. The question there is whether it's going to be in 2 stadiums, which I'm told is possible, SoFi and the Rose Bowl, or just one. Because there's issues with both situations. Rose Bowl has fewer luxury boxes. SoFi has lots of luxury boxes, but the field isn't wide enough. They're going to have to do major work to actually widen the field for World Cup standards.
For a stadium, it's been there 5 minutes.
Well, it's truly stupid when in building this how many $1 billion did they spend on SoFi, that they didn't think about making this wide enough to host World Cup games, because that should be on any NFL stadium being built in the United States. That should be on their mind. It wasn't, apparently, but it is not unsolvable, I'm told. So LA, San Francisco Bay Area, very likely to get games, I'm told. Not a lock, but very likely at Levi's. And then Seattle, a little on the bubble, just due to the numbers game situation, but huge soccer community in Seattle, downtown stadium, likely to get games. There was a question on whether Vancouver re-entering the race and likely to get games was going to help or hurt Seattle, which is close by, but I'm told Seattle's still very likely. And then Atlanta, which has become a very big soccer community around Atlanta United, likely to get games. They were originally pitched as a semifinal host in the bid book that was put forward. That is not set in stone, though, and I'm told now Philadelphia more likely to get that semifinal, but Atlanta's still very much likely to get games. And so then you're left with Nashville, Cincinnati. Nashville ended up I was told that they were close to a lock at one point, but now they are going to build a new NFL stadium in Nashville that may not open until the NFL season starts in 2026. And that has really thrown a wrench into things for their World Cup bid, I'm told, because FIFA doesn't want to have any uncertainty. And if you're saying that stadium's going to be ready for the 26 NFL season, you don't want to have a situation where you commit to that and then it's not ready.
I have to laugh at that as we're playing games in Qatar.
No, I know. I mean, like, you have to, right?
There's a lot of uncertainty about that, too. Still is.
No, obviously. And what I was told is that Nashville may actually host the draw, which kind of makes sense. I could see that going to Nashville. Cincinnati, I'm told, not likely at all. Just for a number of reasons. Nothing really stands out about Cincinnati's bid.
Kansas City's in, though, because of Hunt, you think? Yeah.
Well, that's Kansas City, definitely a bubble situation as well. But what they've got really going for them is the Hunt family. I'm told that Dan Flynn, the former U.S. Soccer CEO, who is now an executive with the organizing committee, is really pushing for the Hunts in Kansas City to get games. So we'll see if that happens. In my list of 10, that I did have Kansas City getting him, and I'll be straight with you. I ended up not having Baltimore, Washington, D.C. as like maybe the last cut. I could be wrong. That could be wrong, but they're still very much in play. But I think there's been some real negativity around the Washington D.C. part of it, which forced this announcement of joining bids last week between Baltimore and D.C. And I think that there's just
It wasn't good news. It was
it's going to be
desperation
tough.
news, kind of, sort of, to some
Yeah,
degree.
yeah.
Well, I hate that it's put that way. Grant Wahl used to be from Baltimore. We're never going to let him back in now that he's picked us 11th. You can find him at Grant Wahl covering all things soccer. What does this mean? You've covered a lot of World Cups. I don't know how far back did you do South Korea and Japan? I probably did, right?
Yeah, my first World Cup was '98 in France.
Okay, so you did. Okay, so doing all of this, seeing all of this, having now been to Russia, having making time to go spend time in the Middle East here, what does it mean for the U.S. And I guess the bigger picture was back in 1994. I'll never forget. I was sitting at Hooters at the Harbor Place in 1994 with Mike Messina. We're drinking beers. It's 1:30 in the morning. It's July. And about 300, a herd of blue and white, came rolling into the harbor drunk, all face painted. They were from Norway. I don't know that I even knew what the World Cup was. I mean, I did, but I didn't, and I forgot they were playing in D.C. And people had stayed in Baltimore in 1994. All these Norwegian people were staying at the Hyatt, drinking beer in the
Mm-hmm.
harbor, wearing blue and white. And I remember that. And then I went to Europe in '06 for the Cup and experienced all of that. But for the United States, where, soccer, one day it'll catch on. Now the MLS, I mean, a lot different than 1994 as to where it is. And certainly the fact that Baltimore has a little piece of this, or could have a piece of this. I think over the next month, there's going to be month and a half for all of these cities as we get ready for Qatar. Certainly the soccer community's engaged, but I'm talking about rank and file sports people to be engaged that this big thing's coming here and might be coming to your hometown.
I mean, it is going to be incredible. And actually, I should correct myself. I did go to games at the '94 World Cup in the US. I wasn't a full time professional journalist. I was too young at the time, but really enjoyed it. And, it's fascinating to me that that '94 World Cup in the US still holds the record for being the best attended World Cup in history. And that's amazing to me when you think that there were fewer teams in that World Cup. There were only 24 teams in that World Cup. So fewer games, and yet it still holds the attendance record for a World Cup. So a 48 team World Cup in the United States in 26 is going to set records for attendance that are going to last a very long time, I think, for a World Cup. Because the attendance, they're going to fill every NFL stadium for all of these games. The US is very good at organizing logistics for things like this, and people from around the world want to come to the United States for a World Cup. So it's going to be impossible for anybody in the United States to somehow not know that the World Cup is taking place in 26 when that happens. And you are going to see, I think, millions of new soccer fans created, as they're often created in the United States during a World Cup, but even more because it'll be happening here. And I almost can't undersell it. I mean, like, or can't oversell it. I mean, like, I really think it's going to be gigantic for the sport here. And, uh, and be obviously a big moneymaker for FIFA as well, and they'll want to come back here in the future. I mean, the fact of the matter is the culture has changed for sports in the United States since the '94 World Cup because this has become much more of a soccer country. When you look, I always look at television and how easy it is now to see soccer games, pro games from around the world on US television. The US used to be one of the worst countries in the world in which to watch professional soccer. It was really hard. Now it's one of the best. And that change has coincided with MLS coming, with women's soccer getting bigger. And it's like soccer, I would say right now overall, is probably bigger than ice hockey at this point in the United States and will only continue to grow. Like every demographic study shows that soccer fandom in the United States is very much a young person's thing. And people 45 and over kind of grew up with this stigma being attached to soccer, and it was talked about as like a communist sport and all this other nonsense. That's changed. If you're under 45, soccer not only doesn't have a stigma anymore, it's viewed as a cool sport. And we're seeing that with all of the US television interest in showing the games, all of the business interest that's growing, and all the interest from these US cities that want to host World Cup games.
You were Mr. Fringe soccer guy before it was cool, Grant Wahl. So, hey, you get back to Baltimore often. I mean, please come have a crab cake. We do the crab cake tour every week, and I know you used to hang out down at Slancha and get some potatoes in the morning there and watch Euro games and like all that. But your wife's done wonderful work, and I want to give you my heart on
Thanks.
that. And in following everything that's gone on in this country over the last 2.5 years, please give her a plug and give Baltimore a plug. And you've left, but your heart is still here from time to time, right?
Oh, definitely. I love coming back whenever I can, and still have a lot of friends down there in Baltimore. And I used to live in Fells Point, loved walking around that area. And
It's the
you
most
mentioned
European place in
Slancha.
America, Fells Point. Like from a visual, when you're standing in Fells Point, you could be in Europe.
But yeah, I miss my time there. But it's still a city that's very close to my heart, so it'll never be completely not a part of me.
All right, you're not like allergic to crab or anything, right?
Oh
You're not.
God, no. Though
No, just making
Old
sure.
Bay never did it for me. Old Bay never did it. But
It's because
like
you ain't from around
the
here.
crabs are all good.
Hey, man, take care. I'm sorry we didn't talk a little bit more regular soccer, but I try to chase you down every couple of years. And when you wrote about this last week for what it means for our city, even though you wrote against us, and I can't wait to text you and say, Philadelphia, they're not getting games. We're getting games. I'm just hopeful. I mean, it's been 2
I
decades,
hear you.
and I don't want to be left with our face pressed to the glass. But at least if we get left out, DC gets left out too. Grant, I appreciate you, man. Take care of yourself.
Thank you. Take care.
Grant Wahl is the best soccer writer in this here country, and he's spent a little time with us. You can find him at grantwahl.com. You can find him at Grant Wahl on Twitter. Hundreds of thousands of people follow him, and I love his front of his Twitter says, "You know nothing, Grant Wahl." So I am Nestor. We are WNST, pulling for World Cup soccer games here in Baltimore. Getting the Maryland Crab Cake Tour back out on the road. It's all brought to you by our friends at Goodwill Industries, as well as our friends at Window Nation and the Maryland Lottery. I'll get some Betty Boop scratch-offs to give away at Conrad's Crabs on Wednesday. And we will continue to get to the bottom of this soccer thing, find out whether we're going to have the World Cup, Copa Mundial, here in Baltimore, hon. I am Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore positive.